Some stories just refuse to die. They dig themselves into the soil of a place, twisting history into something dark, something monstrous. They're passed down in whispers, told around campfires, and sometimes they're carved right into stone. In a quiet, unassuming cemetery in Lafayette, Colorado, there's a story exactly like that. It's a legend born from fear and kept alive by a single damning word on a crude headstone: Transylvania. For over a century, this one grave has been the heart of a terrifying local myth, a place where history and horror bleed together. This is the story of Colorado's vampire grave. The local lore is chilling. It claims the man buried here didn't die a natural death, that he was one of the undead. They say that after he was buried, paranoid townspeople, terrified by a wave of mysterious deaths, came back in the dead of night. They say they dug up his coffin and drove a wooden stake straight through his heart to make sure he'd never rise again. And from that very stake a twisted, unnatural tree grew, a permanent marker of their violent panic. To this day, people claim to see a tall, dark figure lingering here, a silent guard with unnaturally long fingernails, watching from the shadows of his own tomb. So how does a story like this even start? Every legend is built from pieces, gruesome little details that give it shape. The tale of the Lafayette vampire is no different. It's a tapestry woven from local fears, each thread adding another layer of dread to the story of Fodor Glava, the man from Transylvania. It all starts with his death in December of 1918. He was an outsider, a lanky and pale immigrant who mostly kept to himself. In a small, tight-knit mining town, that was enough to make people suspicious. But it was where he came from that sealed his fate after death. Thanks to a novel Bram Stoker had published just 2 decades earlier, Transylvania had become synonymous with one thing: vampires. As the story goes, his death was followed by others. Fear began to spread like a sickness. The whispers started small. Glava was rarely seen in the daylight. He was a loner, and he was from that place. For the terrified and superstitious, the conclusion was simple. It was undeniable. This is where the legend gets really dark. A mob of townspeople, blinded by fear, grabbed their shovels and lanterns and marched to the Lafayette Municipal Cemetery. When they pried open Glava's coffin, the story says their worst fears were confirmed. His body was unnervingly preserved. Blood stained his mouth, his teeth seemed sharper, and his fingernails had kept growing, long and menacing. Now, we know these are just natural, grim realities of decomposition. The appearance of growing hair and nails, the shifting of teeth, the purging of fluids. It's horrifying, but it's science. But to the terrified miners of 1918, it was proof of something unholy. In a final, desperate act, they drove a stake through his chest and quickly buried him again. From there, the legend literally grew. A juniper tree, looking like nothing else in the cemetery, shot up right through the middle of his plot. Locals swore it sprouted directly from that wooden stake. Nearby, rose bushes bloomed, their deep red color and sharp thorns said to have sprung from his bloody fingernails in the dirt below. The story became a local horror classic, drawing paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and thrill seekers, all coming to see the grave and maybe leave a small offering, a coin, a trinket, to appease the spirit they believe is still trapped here. To understand how a man could become a monster, you have to picture the world he died in. Lafayette, Colorado, in the early 1900s was not a gentle place. It was a coal town, built by men who descended into darkness every day, facing the constant threat of cave-ins, explosions, and black lung. These were tough communities, filled with immigrants from all over the world. Eastern Europe, Greece, Mexico, Japan, all looking for a better life, but mostly finding backbreaking work. They lived in crowded company houses, their lives controlled by the mining giants. It was a life of grit, but also one of tension and mistrust. A pale, lanky outsider from a strange land would have stuck out, no question. Then, in 1918, a real monster arrived. Not a vampire, but a virus. The Spanish influenza pandemic swept across the globe with terrifying speed, and it hit Colorado hard. That fall, Lafayette went into quarantine. Schools, churches, theaters, everything shut down. But in the crowded, dirty conditions of a mining town, the flu spread like wildfire. The local newspaper, the Lafayette Leader, tried to be optimistic, but soon it was just printing lists of the dead until the editor himself got too sick to work. Entire families were wiped out. The Congregational Church became a makeshift hospital. By the end of the year, the flu had killed dozens in this one small town. It was a time of unimaginable fear. Death was everywhere. And it was in December of that year, at the peak of this horror, that a 43-year-old coal miner named Fodor Glava died from the pandemic. He was just one of many, but his death became different. In a world being destroyed by a plague they couldn't see, the townspeople found a scapegoat they could. They couldn't fight a virus, but they could fight the monster they imagined was buried in their cemetery. The terror of the pandemic, mixed with the fear of foreigners simmering just beneath the surface, created the perfect storm. Fodor Glava, the immigrant from Transylvania, was no longer a man. He was the target for all their fear. The story of Fodor Glava is a chilling reminder of how easily fear can rewrite history. We're peeling back the layers of this legend, but the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. If you're fascinated by these forgotten corners of the past, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. So, who was the real man at the center of this century-old horror story? When you strip away the folklore, the historical record paints a much simpler and, honestly, a much sadder picture. Theodore Fodor Glava was a real person. Records show he was an immigrant who came to America for work and found it in the coal mines of Colorado. He worked at the Simpson mine, one of the biggest in the area. He died in December 1918, a documented victim of the Spanish flu. He was 43 years old and was survived by a wife who was still back in Europe. By all accounts, he was poor and was buried in the paupers section of the cemetery. This fact alone makes his grave an oddity. In a potter's field, most graves were unmarked. A simple wooden cross was the best you could hope for. Yet Glava's plot has a permanent, hand-made concrete headstone. That headstone is a mystery in itself. It looks like it was carved by a friend, not a professional. The lettering is rough, and the information is both revealing and confusing. It clearly states his name, Transylvania, as his birthplace and his date of death. But there are other names. The stone actually marks the graves of two men, Fodor Glava and another Romanian miner named John Trandafir. They worked together and they died just 2 days apart, both likely from the flu. The stone was made by their friend, George Lazar, and it straddles both of their plots. The name Trandafir only added fuel to the fire. In Romanian, Trandafir means rose. This has led to all sorts of speculation that the rose bushes weren't a coincidence, but were somehow connected to the men buried there. Some people even thought Trandafir was Glava's wife, buried with him. Even his origin isn't totally straightforward. The headstone says Transylvania, but some records list him as Austrian, since Transylvania was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire back then. It's possible he just told his fellow miners he was Transylvanian, a little piece of his identity that after he died got twisted into something monstrous. So what we have are the mundane facts. A poor immigrant miner, killed by a pandemic, buried in a pauper's grave with a strange shared headstone made by a friend. But when you mix those facts with the terror of the flu and the mystique of his homeland, they become the seeds of a legend that would grow into something much darker than the man himself. The sun is setting over Lafayette. Long dancing shadows are stretching across the cemetery grounds. As day turns to dusk, the whole feeling of a place like this changes. The quiet becomes a heavy silence. The stone angels seem to watch you as you pass, and we're walking with a purpose, looking for one particular grave. It's not easy to find. It's in the older northern section, what used to be the potter's field. The headstones here are weathered, some leaning, some broken. We're looking for a flat concrete marker, easy to miss, and then we see it. Set back from the path, almost level with the grass, is the headstone of Fodor Glava. The first thing that hits you is the tree. It's a juniper, rising tall and straight, right from the center of the plot. It really does feel unnatural. Seeing it in person, you get why the legend of the stake took root. It looks like it punctured the very spot where a coffin would be. The headstone is at its base, a rough slab of concrete. You have to crouch down to read the names, Fodor Glava and John Trandafir, to make out Transylvania and the date, Dec. 1918. The grave isn't forgotten. Even now, over 100 years later, people leave things. Small coins glint in the twilight. Trinkets, charms, even dead roses are left as offerings, a modern tribute to the superstition. A former police chief once said he found a doll on the grave with a pin stuck through its heart, a chilling sign that someone truly believed evil was buried here. Standing here as the last light vanishes, the line between fact and folklore starts to get blurry. The history feels distant. What feels real is the cold air, the imposing shape of the tree, and the weight of a century of fear, all focused on this one patch of ground. This is when you start to hear the modern stories. The legend didn't die with the people who created it. People who visit this spot, especially after dark, still report strange things. The most common story is of a tall, thin man in a dark coat, seen sitting on the tombstone or lurking in the trees nearby. They often mention long, dark hair and creepy, long fingernails. Others have claimed their phones or cameras suddenly die, or that they hear whispers on the wind right near the grave. Is it just the power of suggestion? Your mind playing tricks on you because you came looking for a ghost? Or has the sheer force of belief, poured into this grave for over 100 years, actually created something? Standing here in the quiet, it's easy to believe the story isn't just in the past. We came here looking for a vampire. We followed a terrifying story of the undead and a stake through the heart. But after digging past the folklore, what we found wasn't a monster. We found a man. And his story isn't one of supernatural horror, but of human tragedy. Let's just break it down. The monster with bloody lips and growing nails? That was just the natural process of decomposition, misunderstood by people who didn't have our scientific knowledge. The stake driven through his heart? There is absolutely no historical record of this happening. It's pure folklore, likely inspired by the strange sight of that tree growing in the middle of the plot. That tree, a juniper, is known for being rot-resistant, which makes it great for fence posts, and maybe for stakes. A detail that surely fed the legend. The red rose bushes that supposedly grew from his bloody fingernails? they were just rose bushes. One report even clarified that the bush on the grave for many years was actually yellow. The very name on the grave was misunderstood. The headstone marks 2 men, not one, who died in a pandemic. The word trandafir, Romanian for rose, wasn't a cryptic clue. It was part of John Trandafir's name. The heart of the legend rests on 2 simple facts. Fodor Glava was from Transylvania, and he died during a time of incredible fear. He was a victim of the 1918 Spanish flu. His only crime was his birthplace, which, thanks to Dracula, had become linked with ancient evil. Fodor Glava was the perfect scapegoat. An immigrant, an outsider, a lanky and pale man who probably looked that way from poverty and sunless, back-breaking work in a mine. In a town being torn apart by an invisible killer, it was easier to put a face to their fear. It was easier to create a monster they could name and an evil they felt they could contain with a wooden stake. The legend of the Lafayette vampire isn't a supernatural story. It's a story about xenophobia. It's about how fear can turn grief into suspicion and an innocent man into a monster. So, we started this journey looking for a vampire in a small Colorado town. We've walked through the folklore, stood in the cemetery at dusk, and dug into the history of a town gripped by fear. We've dismantled the legend, piece by piece, and found the sad truth. There was no vampire. There was only Fodor Glava, a Romanian coal miner who died in a global pandemic, whose memory was twisted by superstition. And yet, that isn't quite the end of the story. Knowing the facts doesn't totally kill the feeling you get standing at that grave. Explaining how the legend started doesn't explain the modern sightings. It doesn't explain why people today still report seeing a tall, dark figure watching from the trees, or feel a sudden bone-chilling cold spot near the headstone. It doesn't explain the offerings that keep appearing, left by people who still believe, or who are maybe just trying to be safe. Has the legend just become so powerful that it's created its own reality, a kind of psychological haunting? Or is it possible that all the dark energy and fear focused on this one spot for over a century has left a real scar on the place? The historical record can explain the man, but it struggles to explain the shadow that still hangs over his grave. We may have unearthed the truth about Fodor Glava, but we may never fully unearth the mystery he left behind. What do you believe? Is this a closed case of historical misunderstanding, or does something really linger in that cemetery? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of a legend, please like this video and subscribe for more investigations into the world's most enduring mysteries. Thanks for watching.